Stage 1 starts the journey of a fresh Destiny 2 player. They're often very enthusiastic, curious, and they just love exploring what the game has to offer. The player is immediately met by awe-inspiring cinematics that introduce them to the Destiny universe, and the player just starts to scratch the surface of the deep lore and story-based content within the game. This can be a really magical time for the player because every mission, quest step, and experience is brand new, and perhaps unlike anything they've seen before in a video game. If the player didn't play Destiny 1, they experience the thrill of riding a sparrow for the first time, the power fantasy of casting their first super and wielding their first exotic, and they get their first glimpse of the tower they will call home. And of course they also find out that punching the glowing orange shanks might not be the best idea. As they progress through the campaign, the player slowly starts to unlock core activities and locations, but they don't really know what that means just yet. Stage 2 is a time of uncertainty after the player has completed most of the campaign and unlocked the rest of the game because they're really confused on what comes next and how to actually play Destiny. With maybe 10 to 20 hours of playtime under their belt, they have a good understanding of the most basic systems in the game, but they've yet to acquire the skills and gear needed to even consider doing endgame content. In this stage, the player discovers fun things like hurling themselves off the edge of the tower. This is such a common occurrence that an NPC in the tower actually has a voice line saying, "The jumper was a guardian, already rezzed and on their way." The player proceeds to test the waters of the Crucible, but gets completely annihilated by team shots and opponents who seem to be moving impossibly fast, so they go back to PvE to become more comfortable with the game and get more powerful loot. At this stage, they might receive a complaint from a raging teammate accusing them of being a clueless blueberry. Whatever that means anyway. The complicated interface and the sheer number of in-game items and loot can be really overwhelming to the player in this stage, and they seriously have no idea which of the hundreds of mods and perks are actually worth using. The player may just give up at that stage and uninstall, but there's a good chance that they'll start to recognize the potential for making fun and creative builds by combining various perks, mods, and subclasses. The player develops a desire to learn and become more powerful so they can take on more difficult PvE bosses and be more like those crazy guardians they saw in PvP. Man, that guy's just too good. Maybe I could be as good as him one day. Stage 3 is when the player really takes that deep dive into understanding all of the different perks, weapons, and stats. The player starts to get a sense of what the meta is as they create their first viable builds, even if that just means putting on a shotgun and a couple of mods, switching to Titan, and running in a straight line towards their Crucible opponents. Players in this stage often receive advice from more experienced players, or they might watch some YouTube videos to learn some new tips and tricks. Alright, let's see. Destiny 2 tips and tricks. Alright. Use cover? Keep your HP So, after 20 to 60 hours of total playtime, the player begins to gravitate towards certain weapons and subclasses they believe to be powerful. Around this time, the player may also experiment with different classes, but then they fall in love with the power fantasy of a certain subclass and start playing that one more than the others. The player starts to dip their toes into endgame PvP and PvE content, and they start to decide which part of the game they enjoy the most, a decision that will shape their future as a guardian. Although some players may have already joined a clan, most players start to develop friendships and a desire to join a clan to play strikes, quests, Crucible, or even raids. That clan's name is often a vocabulary word that they don't fully understand the meaning of, and the player themselves may even change their name, shorten their name, or add some X's on either side. Although the player has a bit of experience under their belt, they still make classic mistakes like blowing themselves up by launching a rocket at their teammate or at the inside of a Titan bubble. The player gets their first amazing piece of loot, whether it's an awesome exotic, a high stat piece of armor, or a perfectly rolled legendary weapon. Unfortunately, players in this stage might forget to lock their new loot and accidentally delete it later. But regardless, the player feels really excited to test out their new loot in their favorite activities, and they can't wait to feel more powerful. And so begins the endless gameplay loop of the looter shooter. The player gets some loot, and then they use that loot to get even better loot, over and over and over. Stage 5 is all about grinding. The player surpasses 100 hours of playtime and grinds to acquire exotics, weapons, the correct perks on those weapons, armor with good stats, stat distributions, power levels, triumphs, the list goes on. If you see someone who's season level 12 million, they're either in this stage or perhaps one of the most advanced stages. In this stage, the player develops an insatiable hunger for more loot and better loot, and they use their newfound abilities and game knowledge to grow much more powerful. The player is particularly focused on acquiring weapons that are meta and excel in their activity of choice, and they just have to get a good roll so they can kill more guardians in the Crucible or do more DPS in PvE. For example, the player may decide that they really want that perfect roll on the Nightfall loot like the Palindrome, Uzume Sniper, or in the past, perhaps the Mindbender's Ambition. The player runs the Nightfall over and over, and maybe even 100 times until RNG finally rewards them. Honestly, there will always be more loot to grind in Destiny 2, so this can be a recurring stage for the player whenever a new eye-catching piece of loot gets released. Due to spending long hours grinding the loot, the player notices themselves becoming much better at the game. They feel like they're finally able to make decent Crucible plays like sniping people out of their supers, and some of the PvE content begins to feel pretty easy. They even learn how to make the public events heroic. And yes, before you ask, yes, it does take the player until Stage 5 to learn this one. Stage 6 is the Tryhard. Now that the player has acquired some reasonably powerful loot, they embark on the quest of attempting more challenging activities and trying to prove themselves to be a good player. The player sets up a goal for themselves, like getting a 20 kill streak in the Crucible or unlocking a certain title, and they are truly driven to achieve it. In pursuit of that goal, the player will only use the most overpowered and broken weapons in the game and completely disregard the hundreds of other options at their disposal. They will do whatever it takes to succeed, even if that means employing some more advanced techniques. Starting in this stage, the player is usually very focused on either PvP or PvE, and some may even become arrogant and devalue players who don't like the same thing. They make comments like, "Destiny is a PvE game, who cares about the Crucible?" Or conversely, "Shooting Drigs for the 2 millionth time is insanely boring, where's the Crucible content?" At this point, the player also begins to see more success in endgame activities like PvP, trials, raids, and maybe even Grandmaster Nightfalls. Players in this stage have a range of actual skill level, but as tryhards, they are up to the challenge and they do whatever it takes to improve. Especially if the player begins to take the game too seriously, this type of tryhard attitude almost invariably leads the player to Stage 7. At this point, the player has seen enough of the game that they've developed firm opinions about it, and they become frustrated because the game is less than perfect and they have ideas on how it could be improved. Although some of this can happen in earlier stages, this is when the player becomes angry beyond belief about overpowered weapons and abilities in the Crucible. At this point, the player often believes that their opponents only use the most overpowered no-skill weapons, but whatever they happen to be using is, of course, perfectly fine and balanced. The player frequently complains about the game and makes excuses for their mistakes, blaming everything and everyone other than themselves. The player often makes interesting statements about how they hate the game, but somehow it's still their favorite game of all time. Another classic is when they say the game is dead, but then they proceed to get on and play for 8 hours the next day. When the frustration intensifies, there are 3 main ways the player can try to cope with it. The player might simply play less towards the end of every season when there's very little to do and the meta becomes stagnant, and they might take some time off to focus on other games or real life. It's truly unfortunate, but particularly when the player is dissatisfied with their performance, they might resort to using cheats so that they can effortlessly dominate the entire game and feel some sort of twisted sense of satisfaction. Lastly, it's also possible that extreme frustration drives those who have a flair for the dramatic to proclaim to have forever quit the game.
Why? Stop!
But, surprise, surprise, most of them progress to Stage 8. Whenever an exciting season or big expansion releases, players who quit or took a break come flooding back into the game. The population skyrockets, and everyone develops a ton of interest in the new content. After they get past the 10,000 person queue on the loading screen and survive an onslaught of error codes, the player's sense of adventure and excitement is reignited as the discourse around the game reaches a high point and everyone dives into the new content. There's new loot to be acquired, new story missions to play through, sometimes a vast new raid to conquer, fresh seasonal PvE activities to explore, and probably 0 new PvP content, but we don't talk about that part. Some players in this stage become obsessed with the game and play unhealthy amounts until they've exhausted all of the new content. And unfortunately, that can lead to them regressing back to the frustration stage. And honestly, some players just never leave that stage, even when the game is at its best. The player is becoming increasingly successful with endgame content, and they dedicate a lot of playtime towards accomplishing their goals. As they've played for hundreds or perhaps even thousands of hours, they've been through some tough times, but they just keep pushing forward. At this stage, the player's dedication turns them into quite a good player. They get to the point where they're far more powerful than the Guardians in the early stages. They might play Trials of Osiris and raid on a weekly basis with reasonably high success. This stage can contain truly memorable experiences like clutching a flawless Trials game, soloing dungeons or Grandmaster Nightfalls, and attempting or even beating a Day 1 raid. Unfortunately, there's a chance that the player develops an extreme ego during this stage due to their relatively high level of skill. Destiny's status as a very non-competitive game doesn't stop these players from treating the casual 6v6 lobbies like $2 million tournaments, and they probably also require that you have 269 solo flawless raid clears just to join their LFG group. It's not all bad though. At this point, the player might be skilled enough to help other, less experienced Guardians through their activities and actually help them improve. This leads many to establish a deeper connection with the Destiny community that is truly special. Although the player sees the rewards of their dedication, this can also be a painful stage because they've become skilled enough to where they can easily see where the game could be improved. Sometimes Bungie takes months or even years to implement improvements that are desperately needed, and it's extra painful to watch for those who invest so much time into the game. The rare player who reaches this stage has been through all the highs and the lows, and they just come to accept Destiny 2 for what it is. They've firmly established themselves as a Destiny 2 player, and regardless of its strengths and weaknesses as a game, the player is able to find enjoyment from their experiences. They basically fuse all of the previous stages together and become the ultimate Guardian. This player always wants the game to improve, and they provide meaningful and respectful feedback that is actually conducive to improving the game, unlike the rage and hateful comments that someone in the frustration stage might produce. The player also accomplishes goals and objectives they set for themselves. They're very skilled in PvP and/or PvE, and they're a master of their craft. The player accepts that although they may not be number one, they've certainly accomplished a lot, and perhaps even become legend. It takes quite a while for me to make these videos, so if you enjoyed this, please show your support by leaving a like. If you also want to take your support to the next level, I have a Patreon with some pretty cool benefits linked in the description. Next up, if you're a console player who has not yet reached the Ascendance Stage 10, I highly recommend checking out my complete guide to maximizing your performance as a D2 controller player. That video is on the top of your screen now and linked in the description.